The Force binds all things across a galaxy far, far away, but this is not that galaxy. Here, a different kind of order holds sway, the cold mathematics of physics, the quiet hum of warp cores, and the fragile human need to believe that command means certainty. But what happens when the only being who could offer real certainty is not a Jedi, not a god, but a trickster from beyond space itself, who, for the first time in his existence, decides not to play games? The USS Voyager hung in the silence of the Delta Quadrant, 70,000 light-years from every star chart Catherine Janeway had ever memorized. The bridge had gone quiet hours ago. The crew, Starfleet officers and Maquis rebels alike, thrown together by circumstance and her own irreversible choice, had retreated to their quarters, their duty shifts, their private griefs. Only the low thrum of the ship's systems remained, a heartbeat in the dark. In her ready room, the door sealed, Captain Janeway finally let go. She hadn't cried in front of anyone. Not when she'd given the order to destroy the caretaker's array, stranding her own ship alongside the Maquis vessel she'd just spent weeks hunting. Not when Tuvok had quietly confirmed, without editorializing, that the nearest Federation outpost was 70 years away at maximum warp. Not when she'd stood on the bridge afterward and told her crew, with a steadiness she'd manufactured out of sheer will, that they would find a way home. Now, alone, the manufactured steadiness collapsed. She braced both hands against her desk, head bowed, breath coming in short, controlled bursts that weren't controlled at all. 70 years, maybe more. A ship full of people who trusted her, who had no choice but to trust her, and a decision already made that could never be unmade. She had traded her entire crew's future for a moral principle the caretaker's people would never even know she'd upheld. Was it right? Was it hers to decide alone? In the space of minutes, for 150 lives? You know, said a voice behind her, dry and infuriatingly familiar. For someone who just delivered a rousing little speech about finding a way home. You don't seem terribly convinced of it yourself. Janeway spun, one hand instinctively going for a phaser she wasn't wearing. The white flash had come and gone in an instant. And there, lounging against the viewport with the Delta Quadrant's alien starfield, behind him stood Q. Get out, she said, and her voice cracked in a way she despised. That's usually my line, Q said, unmoving. I show up, you order me off your ship. I do something obnoxious to prove a point. We go our separate ways until I get bored again. I know the routine, Captain. This isn't that. Then what is it? She straightened, wiping her face with the back of her hand, hating that he'd seen it, hating more that some small, exhausted part of her was almost relieved not to be alone. Hugh studied her for a long moment, and something in his expression, some flicker beneath the perpetual smirk, was almost unreadable, almost sincere. I don't entirely know, he admitted. The continuum finds you tedious, by the way. A single vessel, one small captain, 70,000 light-years from anyone who could rescue her. Making decisions no Starfleet officer has ever had to make without a fleet, an admiral, or a homeworld to answer to. They think it's beneath our notice. And you don't. I think, Hugh said, and for once there was no theatrical flourish in it, that I have never in the entire history of your insignificant species watched anyone try to do what you're about to try to do. And I find myself curious whether you can actually do it, or whether you're going to fall apart in this room every night while wearing a very convincing mask on the bridge every day. Janeway felt something sharp rise in her chest. Anger, maybe, or the particular humiliation of being seen too clearly. I don't need an omnipotent being amusing himself at my expense, while my crew is out there depending on me. No, Hugh agreed. You don't, which is precisely why I'm not offering that. He straightened, and the starlight behind him seemed to dim, as though even the universe was giving him room to speak plainly. I'm not here to test you, Catherine. Not tonight. I'm here because I think you're about to become something extraordinary, and I think you're about to do it entirely alone, in a locked room, with no one to tell you when you're right. He paused. I could be that someone, if you'd let me. For a long moment, she said nothing. The ready room felt smaller than it had a minute ago. The weight of the ship, of 70 years, of 150 lives, of a decision she could never take back, pressing down on her all over again. Why would you help me? She finally asked. You've never helped anyone. I haven't, Hugh agreed. Consider it an experiment. Perhaps the only one worth running. His eyes met hers. And for once there was no mockery in them at all. You destroyed a bridge home for a principle no one will ever thank you for. I'd like to see what you do next. Outside the viewport, an unfamiliar nebula burned violet and gold. Utterly indifferent to the small captain and the impossible being standing in her ready room. Janeway looked at him for a long moment, still raw, still uncertain, but something in her, some stubborn ember beneath the exhaustion, refused to let this be a moment of weakness she simply endured alone. One condition, she said finally. No one else ever knows. Hugh smiled. Not his usual predator's grin, but something almost gentle. Captain, he said, I wouldn't dream of ruining the mystique. If you want to see more characters collide with iconic Star Trek captains, hit that subscribe button and drop the name of a character you'd want to see in the comments below. Live long and prosper. The next night, she almost didn't let him back in. Janeway had spent the day proving to herself that the previous evening had been an aberration, exhaustion, grief, the natural aftershock of the hardest decision of her career. She'd run a flawless duty shift. She'd reviewed Chakotay's proposed integration plan for the Maquis crew members with the crisp efficiency her officers expected of her. She'd eaten dinner alone in her quarters and told herself that was simply preference, not the absence of anyone she could talk to without it, becoming a command performance. By 2200 hours, alone in her ready room again, she found herself watching the door and hating that she was watching it. The flash of white light came without warning, the way it always would from now on. She was beginning to understand that Q did not knock. You look, Q observed, materializing in the chair across from her desk as though he'd been invited, like someone who spent an entire day performing wellness for an audience of 150 people. I look like a starship captain doing her job, Janeway said, not looking up from her pad. Is that what we're calling it? Hugh crossed one leg over the other, entirely too comfortable in her space. You know, in all the millennia I've observed your species, I've never seen one of. You try quite so hard to convince yourself of something you clearly don't believe. She set the pad down harder than she intended. What do you want from me, Q? Yesterday you said you wanted to help. Tonight you're here to insult my performance review. Both, Q said cheerfully. I contain multitudes. Then, more seriously, I want to know what actually happened in this room last night. Catherine, not the summary. The truth. Janeway exhaled, and something in her posture, the careful, composed line of her shoulders, finally loosened, just slightly, because there was no one to perform for, except a being who had already seen her at her worst. I made a decision that stranded 150 people 70,000 light years from home, she said. I told them I'd get us back. I don't know if that's true. I don't know if I even believe it. And I have to stand on that bridge. Tomorrow and the day after and every day for however many years it takes. And be certain when I'm not certain of anything. Good, Hugh said. She blinked. Good. You just told me something true instead of something reassuring. Do you understand how rarely your species manages that? Hugh leaned forward, elbows on his knees. And for a moment the theatrical arrogance fell away entirely. Catherine, I am not here to tell you that you made the right choice with the array. I don't actually know if you did. And frankly, neither do you. And neither will you, possibly ever. What I can tell you is that the crew doesn't need a captain who's certain. They need a captain who can carry uncertainty without letting it show, and who doesn't confuse the two. That sounds like a very convenient way to avoid answering a difficult question, she said. It's the only honest answer there is. Hugh rose, moving to the viewport, hands clasped behind his back in an uncanny mirror of her own habitual stance. She wondered, briefly, if he'd copied it from watching her, or if some part of her had unconsciously copied it from watching countless captains before her. Let me tell you what I've learned. Watching your Starfleet officers for longer than your species has had written language. The ones who fail are not the ones who feel doubt. They're the ones who let the crew see it at the wrong moment, or who let it calcify into paralysis. The ones who succeed learn to keep two ledgers, the private one, where the doubt lives and gets examined honestly, and the public one, where the crew sees a captain who has already done that, examining and made her peace with the decision. And you're proposing to be my private ledger. I'm proposing, Hugh said, turning back to her. That you have never had one before. Not really. You've had duty. You've had regulations. You've had the comforting fiction that Starfleet Command was somewhere behind you, ready to correct your course if you erred too badly. That fiction is gone, Catherine. You are 70,000 light-years past the reach of any admiral's judgment, good or bad. For the first time in your career, your ledger is entirely your own, and I don't think you know how to keep one without an audience. The words landed harder than she expected because they were true. Every command, decision she'd ever made had existed within a structure, a chain of authority above her, ready to catch her if she fell too far, ready to court-martial her if she strayed too badly. That structure was gone. There was only her and 150 people, and however many years of empty space between here and Earth. So what do I do? She asked, and hated how small the question sounded, even to her own ears. Tonight, Hugh said. Tonight you tell me, honestly, what frightens you most about tomorrow. Not the ship, not the crew roster. You. Janeway was quiet for a long moment. The low hum of Voyager's systems the only sound in the room. That I'll get used to the mask, she finally said. That's somewhere around year 20. I won't be able to tell the difference anymore between the captain I'm pretending to be and whoever I actually am. Hugh looked at her for a long moment, and this time, when he smiled, there was no mockery in it at all. Now, he said quietly, we're getting somewhere. 3 days later, the fault lines aboard Voyager began to show. It started, as these things always did, with something small. A junior engineer, Starfleet, career track, for years at the academy behind her, refused a direct order from Lieutenant Torres. The former Maquis engineer Janeway had provisionally elevated to chief engineer as part of the crew integration. The refusal wasn't insubordination exactly. It was something quieter and more corrosive, a flat, barely concealed unwillingness to take orders from someone who, weeks ago, had been hunted as a terrorist. By the time the report reached Janeway's ready room, it had already metastasized. 2 more incidents. Whispered conversations that stopped when a Starfleet officer walked into a Maquis-heavy section of the ship, and vice versa. Chakotay, to his credit, had handled the immediate disciplinary matter with careful even-handedness. But he'd also flagged, in his report, the deeper current beneath it. This ship had 2 crews wearing one uniform, and the wound was nowhere near healed. You're doing the thing again, Hugh said, appearing in his customary chair without preamble as she stood at the viewport, arms crossed, replaying Chakotay's report in her mind. I don't have time for you tonight, Hugh. I have an integration crisis on a ship with no reinforcements and no away team to reassign the problem to. You have exactly the amount of time you're choosing to give me, Hugh said, unbothered. Which, I notice, is considerably more than you'd admit to anyone else. Tell me about your engineer. Janeway turned, and for once didn't bother concealing her frustration. There was no point. Not with him. Ensign Wildman refused a direct order from Torres because Torres is Maquis. It's not really about the order. It's about 150 people who spent the last several years either hunting each other or being hunted, now expected to share mess halls and duty rosters as though none of that happened. And what does the captain intend to do about it? Address it publicly. Make clear that rank and role aboard this vessel are non-negotiable regardless of former affiliation. She said it the way she'd say it on the bridge tomorrow. Crisp. Decided. Final. That's the policy, Hugh said. I asked what the captain intends to do. She stopped. That's not what I asked you here for. I know precisely what you didn't ask me here for, Hugh said. And there was an edge of genuine challenge in it now. The first she'd heard from him since this strange arrangement began. You asked me here to help you carry the weight no one else can see. Fine. But carrying weight and solving problems are not the same exercise, Catherine, and I think you already suspect that your engineer's insubordination isn't actually the crisis you think it is. Then what is? You, Hugh said simply, still privately believe you made the wrong call giving Torres that commission. Not because she's incompetent. You know perfectly well she isn't. Because some very quiet, very buried part of you is afraid that elevating a Maquis officer over Starfleet personnel this early, this fast was a political decision dressed up as a practical one, and that if it fails, you'll have handed your critics, the ones still whispering in corridors, Proof that you can't be trusted to hold this crew together. The silence that followed was long enough that the ship's ambient hum became audible again. That low mechanical heartbeat she'd come to find strangely comforting. "That's not fair," she said finally, though her voice had lost its earlier crispness. "It's not meant to be fair. It's meant to be true." Hugh rose and crossed the room, stopping a few feet from her. And for a being who could unmake stars, there was something almost careful in how he held himself. "Here is what I've watched you refuse to admit to yourself for 3 days. You don't actually doubt Torres. You doubt whether the crew will let her succeed long enough to prove herself. And you're terrified that your own doubt is going to leak through the mask at the exact moment she needs you to be unshakable." Janeway pressed her palms flat against the cool surface of her desk, steadying herself against a truth she hadn't let herself examine this directly. "So what do I do with that? I can't stand in front of this crew and confess uncertainty about my own command decisions. That's not leadership, that's abdication." "No," Hugh agreed. "But you can stand in front of this crew utterly certain, precisely because you've already had this conversation with me, in private, where the doubt gets to exist safely, examined and exhausted, so that by the time you walk onto that bridge, there's nothing left to leak." He tilted his head, studying her. "That's the ledger, Catherine. That's what it's for. Not to make the doubt disappear. To give it somewhere to go that isn't your face in front of 150 frightened people." Janeway looked at him for a long moment. This impossible, insufferable, inexplicably present being, and felt something shift. Some small recalibration in how she understood the nights ahead. "Torres keeps her commission," she said quietly, more to herself than to him. "And tomorrow, I make that unmistakably clear to every person on this ship, Starfleet and Maquis alike." "There she is," Hugh said softly. And this time, when he vanished in his customary flash of white light, he left her standing a little straighter than she had been an hour before. The pattern held for weeks, then months, a rhythm Janeway found herself, despite everything, coming to depend on. Duty by day, command decisions made in front of a crew that increasingly looked to her not just as their captain, but as the single fixed point in a universe that had otherwise abandoned every certainty they'd once had. And then, most nights, the ready room door sealed. The quiet click of the lock, and cue. It wasn't always comfortable. Some nights, he was maddening, needling her about a decision until she wanted to throw something at his insufferable face, forcing her to defend positions she hadn't fully examined until his relentless questioning exposed the gaps. Other nights, he simply listened, an experience so unfamiliar to a being of his nature that she sometimes caught him looking faintly, startled by his own patience. Tonight was neither. Tonight, 3 months into their arrangement, Hugh arrived to find her staring at a star chart projected above her desk. Voyager's projected course, a thin thread of possibility stretched across an impossible distance. Updated weekly by 7. No, not 7. Not yet. This was still early days. By Kess and the doctor's ongoing astrometric calculations, a distance that never seemed to shrink no matter how many light years they logged. "You're doing the math again," Hugh said, settling into his chair. 75 years, Janeway said, not looking up. "At our current average speed, accounting for necessary detours, hostile territory, and resource constraints, 75 years to reach Federation space. I'll be dead before this ship sees Earth. Most of this crew will be dead. Their children might make it, if they have children. If this crew survives long enough to build any kind of life out here at all. You've done this calculation before. I do it every week. It doesn't get easier." She finally looked up at him, and there was something different in her expression tonight, not the raw grief of the first night, not the frustration of the Torres incident, but a kind of settled, exhausted clarity. "Hugh, I need to ask you something, and I need you to actually answer it instead of deflecting into one of your riddles." "I make no promises," Hugh said, "but ask. Could you get us home? Right now, tonight? With a thought. Could you simply put this ship back in the Alpha Quadrant and end all of this?" The question hung in the air between them, and for the first time in their private sessions, Hugh didn't answer immediately. He rose, moved to the viewport, and was quiet long enough that Janeway began to wonder if she'd finally found the one question that would end their arrangement entirely. "Yes," he said finally. Trivially, I could return this ship to the Alpha Quadrant before you finish that sentence. If I chose to. Something cold settled in Janeway's chest. Not relief, but something closer to dread, because she understood, even before he continued, what he was about to say. And I won't, Hugh said, turning back to her. Not because I take some perverse pleasure in your suffering. Whatever you may think of my species' reputation, I won't do it because it would be the single most destructive thing I could do to you. Destructive, she repeated, and there was real anger in it now. 3 months of exhaustion finding an outlet. You're telling me you could end the suffering of 150 people with a thought, and you're choosing not to, and calling that a mercy. I'm calling it respect, Hugh said, and his voice had lost every trace of its usual theatricality. Catherine, if I hand you your way home, what have you actually accomplished? You'll have survived because an omnipotent being took pity on you. Every decision you make from that day forward, every crisis you navigate, every impossible choice will exist in the shadow of the fact that you didn't actually do it. I did. And some part of you, some part that I suspect you're already too honest to lie to, will always know that. That's not your call to make, she said. Those are real people, real lives, real families who may never. And they are exactly why I won't do it, Hugh said, cutting through her anger with an intensity that silenced her. Because the version of you that gets this crew home, the one who earns it, who bleeds for it, who becomes whatever she has to become across however many years it takes, that version of you is the only one capable of actually keeping them alive for all of it. The captain I hand a shortcut to is not the captain who survives everything, still waiting between here and Earth. I've watched enough of your species to know the difference matters more than you currently have the perspective to see. Janeway stared at him, torn between fury and something that felt uncomfortably like recognition. So what exactly is this? She asked quietly. What are these sessions, if not you helping me? I am helping you, Hugh said. I'm simply not helping you the way you wish I would. I'm not going to solve your problems, Catherine. I'm going to make sure you survive solving them yourself. He paused, and something almost gentle crossed his face. There's a difference, and one day, not tonight. You're too angry with me tonight. You'll understand it's the only kind of help that was ever going to matter. Chakotay noticed first, because Chakotay noticed everything. It wasn't any single moment. Janeway made certain of that, careful in a way that had become almost reflexive after 4 months of nightly sessions to leave no obvious trace. But patterns accumulate whether or not anyone intends them to. And her first officer had spent enough years reading people, first in Starfleet and then in a cell of Maquis resistance fighters who couldn't afford to misjudge a face, that the accumulation eventually became impossible to ignore. He raised it carefully, the way he raised everything with her, over a working dinner in her ready room, ostensibly to review supply requisitions, the pad between them mostly forgotten. Can I say something that isn't in my official capacity as first officer? He asked. Janeway set down her fork, wary. Go ahead. You're different than you were 4 months ago. Not worse, he added quickly, seeing something cross her face. Different. Steadier, somehow, in a way I can't quite account for. You walk onto that bridge every morning like you already know how the day is going to go, even when nothing about our situation would justify that kind of certainty. He studied her, careful, searching. I've served under captains who project confidence because they've learned to fake it convincingly. This doesn't feel like that. It feels like you've actually found something. I just can't figure out what. The question landed with more precision than she was comfortable with. And Janeway was aware, with the particular clarity of someone who has spent months keeping a secret, of exactly how much rode on her answer. I've had time to think, she said, which was true, if incomplete. Time to make peace with the scope of what we're facing. That's all. Chakotay didn't push. Not directly, but she saw the flicker of something in his expression that told her he didn't entirely believe her, and that he was choosing, for now, to let the matter rest out of respect rather than satisfaction. It was, she thought later, one of the qualities that made him genuinely valuable as a first officer. The discipline to recognize when trust meant not asking a second time. That night, she told Q about the exchange. And for once it was she who was doing the needling. He's going to figure it out eventually, she said. Chakotay doesn't miss things. Sooner or later he's going to walk in on one of these sessions. or piece together the pattern of when my door locks, or simply ask a question I can't deflect a second time. Does that frighten you? Hugh asked, genuinely curious rather than provocative for once. It should, shouldn't it? What exactly would I tell him? That an omnipotent entity from beyond known space has been privately mentoring me because he finds my psychological survival an interesting experiment? He'd have grounds to question my fitness for command, and he'd be right too. Would he? Hugh tilted his head. I wonder. I think your first officer suspects something considerably less strange than the truth and considerably more mundane, that you have a source of private counsel he's not privy to. Officers have had those before. Priests, therapists, old mentors from the academy, contacted via subspace when subspace still reached that far. The specifics would surprise him. The existence of the arrangement itself, I suspect, would not. That's generous of you to assume. I don't assume it generously. I assume it because I've watched him for 4 months too. Catherine, and Chakotay strikes me as a man who understands better than most of your crew. That command is a lonely business that occasionally requires unconventional support. Hugh's expression shifted, something more serious settling into it. The real question isn't whether he'll eventually notice. It's what you're afraid he'll conclude if he does. Janeway was quiet for a moment, turning the question over with the same careful scrutiny she'd learned across these months to apply to her own reflexive answers. That I'm not strong enough to do this alone, she admitted finally. That the captain everyone believes is holding this ship together through sheer will is actually being propped up by outside intervention. That it isn't really me. And is it? Hugh asked. Really you? She thought about the Torres decision. The 3 separate crises since, a hull breach in the cargo bay, a first contact situation with a xenophobic species that had nearly ended in disaster, a near mutiny from a disaffected Maquis faction that she'd talked down alone, on the bridge, in real time, with no one whispering answers in her ear. Every single decision, in the moment, had been hers. Hugh had never once told her what to do. He had only ever made her capable of deciding for herself. Yes, she said, and heard the certainty in her own voice, unrehearsed. It's me. Then perhaps, Hugh said, that's precisely what you should tell yourself. The next time you're afraid of what? Chakotay might conclude. Not what I'd tell him. What you'd tell yourself. The 6th month brought the closest thing to a genuine argument their arrangement had yet produced. It began with a border dispute, a minor, forgettable technical matter by the standards of what Voyager had already survived. A pre-warp species inhabiting a system directly in Voyager's projected course had detected the ship's approach and interpreted it, understandably enough, as an invasion. Janeway had spent 2 days navigating increasingly hostile hails, trying to de-escalate a first contact scenario that seemed determined to end in violence despite her best efforts, and had finally succeeded through a combination of patience, a carefully calibrated demonstration of restraint, and a personal apology transmitted in the species' own language, painstakingly translated by the doctor. It had worked. No one had died. The ship had passed through the system without incident, and by any reasonable measure, it was a quiet victory that would never make it into any log entry beyond a routine notation. Janeway, that night, wanted Hugh to tell her she'd done well. You handled it competently, Hugh said, in the tone of someone offering the barest acknowledgement necessary to avoid outright rudeness. Competently, Janeway repeated, something prickling in her chest that she recognized, with some embarrassment, as genuine hurt. 2 days of careful diplomacy. An entire species talked back from the edge of open conflict. No casualties on either side, and the word you've chosen is competently. Would you prefer I lied to you? I would prefer, she said, with more heat than she intended, that after 6 months of being told everything I do wrong, I might occasionally hear that I did something right. Hugh was quiet for a moment, and something in his expression, a rare flicker of genuine consideration, rather than his usual performative theatricality, suggested he was actually weighing her frustration, rather than simply deflecting it. You did do something right, he said finally. You avoided a violent first contact scenario through patience and restraint, which is more than I can say for most of the captains your Starfleet has produced across its brief Undistinguished history. That's true, and I don't dispute it. He paused. But I think you're asking me for something else entirely. And I think you already know it. Enlighten me. You're asking me to be the audience you don't have, Hugh said. And there was no cruelty in it. Only a bluntness that landed harder for its honesty. You want someone to applaud. Catherine. Someone to confirm not just that the decision was sound, but that you are, fundamentally, doing well. That you're good at this. That the crew's faith in you is earned and not merely convenient. Because they have no other option. And I understand the impulse. Command is lonely, and you have no one left who outranks you. No admiral to send you a commendation. No peer captain to compare notes with over drinks at a starbase bar. I am the only audience available to you, and I think some part of you has begun to want me to fill that role. The accuracy of it stung more than any of his usual barbs. And you won't. I won't, Hugh confirmed. Because if I become your audience, Catherine, then I've simply replaced Starfleet Command with something worse, a private validation. You require in order to believe your own judgment is sound. That's not strength. That's dependency wearing strength's uniform. And the day I vanish, because I will, eventually, whether by my own choice or the continuums, you'll discover. You never actually learned to trust yourself. You only learned to trust my approval of you. Janeway stood, moving to the viewport, arms wrapped around herself in a gesture she rarely allowed herself, even in private. Then what am I supposed to do with a genuine success, Hugh? Just absorb it silently and move on to the next crisis. Forever, with no acknowledgement at all. No, Hugh said, and his voice softened, just slightly. You're supposed to know, yourself, without requiring my confirmation, that it was good. That's the entire exercise, Catherine. Not to make me your source of certainty. To make you your own. He rose, crossing to stand beside her at the viewport. The strange nebula-lit dark of the Delta Quadrant spread out before them both. You spent 2 days avoiding a war. Through patience most captains in your fleet would never have managed. You know that. You don't need me to say it for it to be true. The fact that you want me to say it anyway. That's the last piece we haven't dealt with yet. She was quiet for a long moment, watching the light bend strangely through an unfamiliar nebula. Some part of her recognizing, with reluctant clarity, that he was right, and that the recognition itself, however uncomfortable, was progress she couldn't have named 6 months ago. You're a terrible mentor, she said finally, without real heat. I'm the only one you've got, Hugh said, which, I'll remind you, was entirely your own idea. The crisis that tested Q's resolve came in month 8, and it was nothing so clean as a diplomatic standoff or a crew integration dispute. It was a hull breach in the primary power conduit during an ion storm. 3 decks flooding with plasma discharge. 12 crew members trapped behind a collapsed bulkhead in engineering. And Torres, the same officer whose commission Janeway had fought to protect 8 months earlier, unconscious and bleeding among them. Janeway ran the crisis from the bridge for 6 hours straight, coordinating evacuation routes, rerouting power through systems never designed for this kind of cascading failure, making triage decisions about which sections could be saved and which had to be sealed to prevent the breach from spreading shipwide. 2 crew members died before the bulkhead could be cleared. It was, by any measure, the worst single-night Voyager had endured since the caretaker's array. She didn't go to Q that night. She couldn't. The crisis ran until 0400, and when it finally ended, she collapsed into her bed, still in uniform, and slept 4 hours before duty resumed. But the following evening, when the ready room door finally sealed behind her, she was raw in a way months of private sessions hadn't fully prepared her for. Fix it, she said, before Q had even fully materialized. Not the ship. The ship's fixed. We lost 2 people, but the ship is fixed. Go back. 6 hours. Warn me about the conduit failure before it happens. You can do that. You told me yourself you could put this ship back in the Alpha Quadrant with a thought. This is nothing by comparison. Go back 6 hours and let me save them. Q's expression, when he finally spoke, held none of its usual theatrical distance. No. Don't you dare give me another lecture about earning things the hard way, Janeway said, and her voice broke on the last word. The composure of 8 months finally giving out entirely. 2 people are dead, Q. Ensign Hendricks had a family he talked about constantly. Crewman Delgado was 23 years old. I don't want a philosophy lesson about what I need to learn from this. I want you to fix it because you can, and because for once in your existence that might actually mean something. I understand why you're asking, Hugh said quietly. I want you to understand why I won't. Then explain it to me in terms that don't sound like you're protecting your own precious experiment. Hugh flinched, genuinely, visibly, something she had never once seen from him in 8 months of nightly encounters. And for a moment he said nothing at all, as though the accusation had actually landed somewhere real. If I go back 6 hours and prevent that conduit failure, he said finally, I am not merely saving 2 lives, Catherine, though I understand that's the only calculation that matters to you tonight. I am establishing, permanently, that when your judgment fails, and it will fail again, because you are mortal and this journey is decades long, there exists a safety net that will simply erase the consequence. And once that precedent exists, it doesn't stop at tonight. You will come to me again, and again, every crisis, every death, every mistake, you will ask me to unmake it. And some night, I suspect sooner than you'd like to believe, I will refuse, because even I cannot rewrite every consequence of a 70-year journey without eventually breaking something far larger than either of us understands. And on that night, you will have built your entire command identity around a safety net that was never actually permanent. You will be less prepared for that loss than you are for tonight's. That's a coward's logic dressed up as wisdom, Janeway said, tears finally breaking through 8 months of careful restraint. 2 people died on my ship tonight, and you're telling me you won't stop it because of a hypothetical failure years from now. I'm telling you, Hugh said, and his voice, for the first time, carried something that sounded almost like grief of his own, that Ensign Hendricks and crewman Delgado died because you are 70,000 light years from anyone who could have prevented it, on a ship with a skeleton crew and equipment never designed for a journey this long, making decisions in real time with no margin for error. And that is not a failure of your judgment, Catherine. That is the actual, unbearable cost of the choice you made 8 months ago, the one you have never once let yourself simply grieve without immediately trying to fix it. I cannot give you the version of tonight where no one dies. No one can. What I can do is stay in this room with you while you feel the entire weight of it, instead of letting me carry it for you. Janeway sank into her chair, the fight going out of her all at once, replaced by something rawer and far more honest. I don't know how to just feel it, she whispered. I don't know how to grieve them and still walk onto that bridge tomorrow. I know, Hugh said, and for once, he simply sat with her in the silence that followed, offering no lesson, no needling, no philosophy, only presence, for as long as she needed it. Grief, Janeway learned over the following weeks, did not resolve on any schedule convenient to a command career. She held the memorial service for Hendricks, and Delgado with the composed dignity the crew needed to see, spoke words about sacrifice and duty that she meant with her whole heart, even as some private part of her still raged against the unfairness of a universe that demanded this cost from people who'd never asked for a 70-year odyssey. She signed the letters that would wait, undelivered, in the ship's databanks for however many decades until they reached families who had no idea their sons weren't coming home. And then, because the ship did not stop needing a captain simply because its captain was grieving, she kept going. It was during this period, raw, quieter than usual, more careful with herself in ways that were subtle but real, that Chakotay came closest to the truth. He found her in the ready room on a night when Q hadn't yet arrived, ostensibly to deliver an updated casualty report she'd already read twice. Though they both understood the report was a pretext, he set the pad down and didn't leave. I want to say something, and I need you to let me say it without deflecting, he said. Janeway set down her own pad, wary but not unwelcoming. Go ahead. I've served with a lot of commanding officers, Chakotay said. Starfleet captains before the Maquis, resistance leaders after. I know what it looks like when someone is barely holding together and hiding it well. I know what it looks like when someone genuinely has their footing. What I don't fully understand is what I've been watching for the last 8 months. Because it doesn't look like either of those things. It looks like someone who has access to counsel the rest of us don't. He paused, watching her carefully. I'm not asking you to tell me who or what. I've thought about it. A subspace connection to someone from your past. Some private discipline you learned at the academy. Maybe just your own extraordinary will. I don't need the specifics, Catherine. I need to know it's not something that puts the ship at risk. The question landed with a precision that told her Chakotay had thought about this far longer, and more carefully than his casual delivery suggested. Janeway held his gaze, weighing 8 months of careful secrecy against the very real trust this man had placed in her, unasked, since the day she'd made him her first officer despite the war they'd waged against each other only weeks before. It's not a risk to this ship, she said finally. I give you my word on that, unconditionally. What I have, the Council, as you put it, has never once told me what to do. It has only ever made me capable of deciding for myself, and it has never once acted against this crew's interests. I can't tell you more than that right now. I need you to trust that it's the truth. Chakotay studied her for a long moment, and she watched him weigh her answer, the way she imagined he'd once weighed the loyalty of Maquis cell members, whose lives depended on his judgment being sound. I trust you, he said finally. I've trusted you since caretaker, even when I didn't want to. I'm not going to stop now over something I can't fully understand. He moved toward the door, then paused. For what it's worth, whatever it is, whoever it is, it's working. This crew is alive today, in no small part, because you found some way to carry a weight that would have broken most people. I've known. I don't need to understand the mechanism to recognize the result. After he'd gone, Hugh materialized in his usual chair, having clearly waited out the exchange from wherever he retreated to when he chose invisibility over absence. He's a remarkable officer, Hugh said. You should tell him the truth eventually, you know? Not tonight. Not this year, perhaps. But eventually. Why? Janeway asked. You've spent 8 months teaching me that this has to be mine alone. It does, Hugh agreed. The decisions, the judgment, the strength, all of it is yours, and will remain yours regardless of who eventually learns about these conversations. But there's a difference, Catherine, between doing something alone and being alone while you do it. Chakotay just demonstrated he can hold your secret without needing to understand it. That's not weakness in your armor. That's the beginning of the kind of support system that will actually sustain you across 70 years. 1. I was never meant to be a permanent substitute for. By month 11, the sessions had grown less frequent. Not because the difficulty of command had lessened, but because something in Janeway had genuinely, measurably changed. She still faced impossible decisions weekly. She still carried the weight of every life aboard as a constant physical presence at the base of her spine. But she no longer needed nightly counsel to carry it. She had, somewhere across those 11 months, built the internal architecture Hugh had been trying to help her construct from the very first night, which was why, when the true test arrived, Hugh did something he had never once done before. He appeared, and then he said nothing at all. The crisis began with a subspace anomaly that Voyager's sensors hadn't fully mapped before the ship was caught in its gravimetric shear. Systems failed in cascading sequence, first navigation, then primary power, then, catastrophically, life support across 4 decks simultaneously. The doctor's program destabilized. Tuvok was thrown against a bulkhead during the initial shock and knocked unconscious. Chakotay was trapped in a turbolift between decks with no way to reach the bridge. For the first time since caretaker, Janeway found herself facing a ship-wide emergency with her senior staff scattered, unreachable, and no one beside her at the command chair capable of sharing the weight of what came next. She felt Q's presence the moment the crisis began, not visible, not speaking, simply there, in the periphery of her awareness, the way she'd learned to recognize. Across 11 months of nightly encounters, she understood, with a clarity that would have terrified her a year ago and now simply steadied her, that he was watching and that he did not intend to help. For 3 hours, Catherine Janeway commanded Voyager entirely alone. She rerouted auxiliary power to life support using engineering protocols she'd half remembered from her academy days and reconstructed under pressure, working alongside a skeleton bridge crew of ensigns and lieutenants, junior enough that none of them had faced anything like this before. She made the call to vent a compromised section of deck 9 to space rather than risk the anomalies sheer tearing through to the warp core, a decision that would have been unthinkable to make alone 11 months ago. when every choice had felt like it required someone else's confirmation before she could trust it. She talked a panicking ensign through an emergency bypass procedure, over comms while simultaneously coordinating a rescue attempt for Chakotay's stranded turbolift, her voice never once betraying the fear coursing beneath every decision. When the anomaly finally released the ship and systems began cascading back online, Janeway sat in the command chair in the sudden, ringing silence of a crisis survived, and understood, with a certainty that felt entirely, undeniably her own, that she had done this. Not with Q's counsel whispered in her ear, not with a safety net waiting to catch her. Alone, in real time, with nothing but 11 months of hard-won judgment and a crew who had trusted her completely, because she had finally learned to trust herself first. That night, when the ready room door sealed and Q materialized, there was something different in his bearing. Not his usual performative arrival, but something quieter, almost reverent. "You didn't say anything," Janeway said. 3 hours. You were there. I could feel it. And you said absolutely nothing." "There was nothing to say," Q said. "For the first time since I began this experiment, Catherine, I watched you and found I had no counsel to offer that you hadn't already given yourself." He studied her, and something in his ancient, unreadable eyes held an expression she'd never seen from him before, something that, on a mortal face, she might have called pride. "Do you understand what happened today? I commanded my ship through a crisis," she said. "You commanded your ship through a crisis without me," Q said. "Without your first officer. Without your security chief. Without a single member of your senior staff beside you. 11 months ago, that scenario would have broken you. Not because you lacked the tactical skill. You always had that. But because you didn't yet trust that your judgment, alone, unwitnessed, unconfirmed by anyone, was sufficient. Today, you never once reached for me. I know, because I was there, waiting to see if you would." Janeway absorbed this, feeling something settle in her chest that had nothing to do with exhaustion. A quiet, hard-won certainty that felt entirely unlike the manufactured composure of her first night in this room. 11 months and a lifetime ago. "I think," she said slowly, "that tonight might be the last time I need this room to feel this way." "I think," Q said, rising, his form already beginning to shimmer at the edges with the telltale flicker that preceded his departures, "that you're finally right." Q did not vanish entirely, not that night, and not in the months that followed. But the shape of his presence changed the way the shape of a scaffold changes once the building beneath it can finally bear its own weight. He appeared less often. He asked more questions than he answered. And increasingly, on the rare nights he still materialized in her ready room, it was not because Janeway needed him there, but because he had, in his own inscrutable way, come to genuinely enjoy her company, a fact that seemed to startle him almost as much as it startled her. "You realize," she said to him, some 4 months after the anomaly crisis, nearly a full year into their strange and unprecedented arrangement, that you've become something dangerously close to a friend." "Don't be absurd," Q said, with a theatrical scoff that didn't quite land the way his old ones used to. "I am an omnipotent being observing an interesting specimen. Friendship implies equivalence. And I assure you, Catherine, there is no equivalence between us." "Of course not," Janeway said, and let herself smile, a real smile, unguarded. The kind she'd have been careful to hide from anyone else aboard this ship, but no longer felt any need to hide from him. Purely scientific interest. "I understand completely." Something shifted in Q's expression, some flicker of an emotion he'd never fully admit to feeling. "The continuum," he said, "still finds you tedious. A minor curiosity in an insignificant corner of an insignificant galaxy. And what do you find me?" He was quiet for a long moment, the ship's familiar hum filling the silence between them. A silence that no longer felt like the exhausted void of that first terrible night, but something closer to companionship, hard-earned and entirely her own. "Extraordinary," Q said finally, without a trace of mockery. "Utterly, tediously extraordinary." She never told the crew. She told Chakotay, eventually, years later, when the truth had stopped being a secret that needed protecting and become simply a chapter of a longer story. He listened without judgment, the way she'd always suspected he would. The captain her crew came to know, steady, formidable, unshakable across 70 Thousand light years of impossible distance was never a performance Hugh had authored for her. He had simply refused to let her believe, on the nights when belief felt impossible, that she couldn't build it herself. And somewhere in the vast indifference of the continuum, an omnipotent being who had never once helped anyone found himself, changed by the one human he'd chosen not to save.